I'm Andrea Campbell, and I am the council president, and I will be the council president to the end of this term. I'm also the District 4 councilor, so I represent largely Dorchester, Mattapan, a little bit of Jamaica Plain, and Rosendale. I was just elected to start my third term, which will start in January, so I've been on the council for 4 years. What I love about my district, it is predominantly a district of color. It is, by certain pockets or certain neighborhoods, one of the poorest in the city of Boston. We have a large immigrant population, a Haitian population, a Vietnamese population that we serve, a Latinx population representing many countries, a Haitian population, Cape Verdean, Portuguese, you name it. And many of these groups are fast growing. I am born and raised in the city of Boston. I grew up in Roxbury in the South End. I am a product of Boston Public Schools. I say that proudly. I am a lawyer by training, so after leaving Boston Latin, I went to Princeton University and then UCLA for law school. And I came back and I started my legal career working for a nonprofit, providing children and their families free legal services in education cases, school discipline, special needs cases, all for free. Most of the families were families of color, largely against BPS, so I say it's interesting where I sit now. In addition to that work, I went into the private sector for a little bit and ultimately also worked with Governor Patrick as one of his attorneys. The reason I decided to run for office was after losing my twin brother, Andre. So I had a twin brother who passed away in January. It will be 8 years. He passed away while in the custody of the Department of Correction, which oversees, isn't that better? Peace. But he passed away while in the custody of the Department of Correction, which in Massachusetts, they oversee our prisons here in Massachusetts. He was a pretrial detainee for 2 years, which meant that he was waiting for trial, had a high cash bail. And I always stress pretrial detainee because we often hear about that in the context of foreign countries and other countries, but it happens right here in Massachusetts. He had scleroderma, which is a autoimmune disease, no cure, had been doing really well. He gets into the custody of the DOC, and as a result of receiving inadequate health care, passes away while in that system when he was 29 years old. And so I asked him deep questions. Why am I here? What am I meant to do with my life? Very spiritual person and prayed a lot, and ultimately decided to run for office to challenge a 32-year incumbent. People thought I was crazy. We ran a grassroots campaign, and ultimately here we are. So I focus on many issues: criminal justice reform, obviously because of my brother's connection to that system; education, Boston Public Schools, I am passionate about. I had a great experience going through BPS. My brother, not so much. When I started looking back, some of the schools he was assigned to, the quality was not great. So I know some of you have handouts for a plan of doing more with respect to education, particularly expanding access to more families, doing more for our English language learners and more for our special needs students. Often these students are concentrated in a lot of schools with limited resources, which is a problem. I also focus on transparency and accountability. So as council president, introduced an ordinance calling for an inspector general, so someone who can look at all of our departments and make sure that they are showing up fairly for residents and not playing favoritism, but doing it in a transparent way, making sure we're spending your taxpayer dollars efficiently and effectively. So that's a big thing we're working on. I focus on public safety issues, and that's a wide range. I have a lot of shootings and stabbings that happen in my district. So for me, it's bringing people together to come up with solutions and ideas so that we don't have that. And we know that's about economic development, opportunity, jobs, housing, making sure people have good housing stock, that kind of thing. I also recently have partnered with Councilor Flynn to focus on domestic violence, sexual assault, and child abuse, which is a big public safety issue in many communities, including our immigrant communities. And the list is long for public safety issues. I've talked too long. It's been an honor to be council president because I'm representing the most diverse council in the history of Boston with 6 women of color. That's only going to expand next year, which is very exciting. We'll have 8 women. The first time we'll have a Latina, which is crazy, but that's exciting. Someone who identifies openly as LGBTQ. So it's going to be interesting next year, and I hope to actually stay in contact with you guys I think what we struggle with a little bit is getting our message out to certain communities that identify as immigrant, and we want to do better, particularly given the context of what's happening in Washington, D.C. We built a lot of relationships with organizations on the ground that serve many of these populations, and because of that, we have folks who, even though they might be living in some sense of fear, we go through those organizations and they still contact us. We're still connected with them, which is really great. But we want to pull them more into the work. We want them to be at the table designing solutions to the problems they see, recognizing they show up differently sometimes with respect to immigrant communities. So I'm excited to answer questions, talk about anything you guys want to talk about.
Issue that has been how to reach out for services and education is also a very important issue to address.
No, I appreciate you bringing that up. And the only way I actually learned about that recently was we had a hearing on health disparities in various communities, and there was a woman who came from Tufts Medical Center and who talked about how we gather data. So on the one hand, there are some stats. It's great to have data, but sometimes it's not always correct or accurate. And so there are organizations on the ground not only pulling numbers, but pulling qualitative data and talking to actual residents about what they're seeing as a problem. And gambling came up in certain communities. And she said, you would never have known that if you went through traditional ways of gathering data. So this came up, and I think to connect it to the public safety realm, I hadn't really thought about that. Why does that align the two for you? Public safety, gambling, mental health, yes, absolutely. We talk about that in the public safety context. Just curious.
Yeah, because gambling issue sometimes happened in families that are most directly affected. Because I talked to a researcher at Tufts Medical Center, and she said usually it's the wives of the gambler who usually come to for help, to seek help, not the gambler themselves. So it's directly affecting their family and their way of living. So I think that's why I think it's really a public safety issue. And sometimes it's it is about family, but within the community, if no one's talking about it, it's not healthy or a good way to grow the community.
No, this is very helpful. Thank you. And I'm open to questions or just listening to.
I have a concern is housing is the most prominent issues in Boston City and everywhere. So the city councils need to concentrate that more resource to the Dorchester area. Dorchester areas need more housing. So I heard a lot of news that comes. They build in South Boston, and Beacon Hills, and there's a big building over there. There's not in Dorchester.
That's right.
So we have to concentrate in largest areas in the Massachusetts is Dorchester. So
that's my biggest neighborhood is Dorchester.
Build more house over there. A lot of people over there.
And that came up actually in a meeting yesterday with someone who does development and also a little bit of architectural work. He's now almost retiring, but he was saying one of the things he struggles with is as we build these larger buildings in the downtown areas or seaports, many push for those resources through IDP, the inclusionary development policy, linkage, to stay down here, and they sit in this fund. He goes, more developers want to see more of that money going to some of the outer neighborhoods like Dorchester and Mattapan for more housing opportunities, as defined by community. So in some instances, people are saying we want more affordable housing. In some pockets, they're saying we want mixed, right? We want affordable at different levels. So there's opportunity to do more. One of the things when I first got to the council I pushed for was the Community Preservation Act. And it was a tax measure and people weren't happy, but why I did it is because it generates millions of dollars every single year for housing. And so we keep pushing for that money to come to Dorchester.
Yeah, I like that idea. That this year, how much
Yeah.
money they collect last year?
For
Yeah.
IDP,
For the collect money
For
the
CPA?
housing, yeah.
oh, millions. Millions.
Yeah, that's good.
And then another piece that we're working on is city-owned vacant lots. There are a lot of city-owned
Yeah.
vacant lots that can be activated for housing and other community purposes as well. So we just took a tour last week with a whole bunch of people to say, how can we begin to pull resources together along with community to build and to do creative things on those lots. And they're all across my district, majority in Dorchester. And some are large that could be used for housing.
Yeah.
So I appreciate you bringing that up. What else? That also is a very big issue, particularly in certain parts of the district with families that are not gaining access to good BPS schools. And I'll give you one example. I have a 2-year-old son. I'm expecting a second one at the end of the year. But we live in Mattapan. And when I was reviewing all these reports before putting together the plan, it's, if you live in certain downtown neighborhoods, Charlestown is also a part of that. You have an 80% chance of getting into a high-quality Boston Public School. If you live in Mattapan, it's 5%. In certain parts of Dorchester, it's probably it's definitely less than 50%. And so that access piece is a really critical issue for families. Either families move or they find themselves stuck in a school that is not the best school for their family. So I'm curious what you guys hear around that issue, if anything. And then the second piece, just given the audience here, is we are pushing a lot within the education context for data to be disaggregated, particularly for Asian community. Because what we're finding is when you lump all Asians together, you are missing important stats. So for example, if you pull apart some data, there is some metrics that show that Vietnamese students, including at Latin school where I went, are doing worse than other students of color, namely other black students, for example, or other Latino students. And that can get lost when you lump everyone together. So then how can you come up with solutions to address whatever those families are going through if you're lumping all these groups together? So that has been a big part of the conversation too, is this disaggregation of data across different racial groups to learn more.
How about one?
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
How about one solution, like one school you can do like a 20% Asian, 20% white, 20%. You make that that numbers, make it up try that number and see what happens. Because some school in Dorchester are mostly black, or some of them
Mostly white.
Yeah, mostly white.
Yep, that's right.
So how we make it a percent like that? So,
I don't know if it passed legal
Well,
muster. We that was tried, but I hear you. Yeah, we can definitely, I think, we have to think more creatively about it. And even with the exam schools, people have put forth different solutions and ideas to make sure that these schools are more diverse, given the fact that the majority of our population of students are students of color.
yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The plan, we talk about, we need to revamp that formula and make it more user-friendly, because most don't understand. So you go through the assignment process, which is complicated. So for example, for the school year next year, my son is 2, he'll be 3 next year. The pre-registration starts in mid-December of this year. Many families don't even know that. And so you fare better in the assignment process when you start early. So the question is, how are we reaching certain communities to make sure they have that information? Much of this you have to do online. There are some communities that do not have access to technology, or you have to go into a welcome center that is maybe not close to your home. So it's a complex, cumbersome process that really needs to be more user-friendly and broken apart. And we heard that from so many families. But you go through a system that then assigns you based on your address, your home address, schools within sort of a zoned area, a home-based area. They rank those schools, send that information out to you, you then select. What we're finding is not many parents are getting their first choice. They go visit, they want this school, they don't get in, they're put on the wait list. or there are not enough seats. So then they have to keep going until they find something. And the challenge is with certain neighborhoods, the schools around you, if the quality. So in the report, there's a piece that's a little wonky, a little nerdy, that talks about changing it from assigning to schools, but doing it by the number of seats. And so that you have access, every family has access, for example, to a high quality seat. And thereby hopefully expanding access to a good quality school as well. But these are recommendations that I'm hoping the system and BPS and the superintendent will adopt so that families have greater access. But the elephant in the room in every education context is how are we expanding the quality of our schools so we have more quality schools in the system for our families to attend, and better programming, particularly for English language learners and those who are just coming to Boston from other countries. I am a firm believer that government, this place, works at its best when residents are at the table having the conversation with you, not only naming what the problem is from their perspective. So for example, we would not know about gambling in certain communities unless you're talking to residents on the ground, but naming what the problem is and then also sort of giving them space to talk about what the solutions are. Just like you named some solutions in education, we can go back and forth on what we can actually do legally and all of that, but we need to hear from folks because that's when we have the greatest impact and that's when we really engage. The challenge is right now, we have, for example, we have over 70,000 people that live in my district. On average, most elections, less than 10,000 people show up. In the last, less than 5,000 voted. In the election before that, when the mayor was on the ballot, we had about maybe 9,000 folks, still less than 10,000. What was shocking to us internally as a team is even some of the folks who come out and vote, we don't hear from them. So the number of people engaging with our office is far less. So we started talking to various folks who work on civic engagement, organizations, health centers, community-based centers, schools, churches, right? There's a wide range of organizations to say, how do you reach your people? How do you pull them or help us get not only our information to them, but also pull them into the conversations we're having? And how do we encourage them to be at the table? I even hired someone externally to help with that work. By the way, this budget in the council, that we have no budget. So I'm paying this person from outside to be able to do this work because I think it's so important. And we define for our office what civic engagement looks like. It's not one end of the spectrum is, here's some information, thank you, goodbye. The other end is we're co-creating and co-designing policies together to help you and your family, in your community. And we're trying to move more of our people to that end of the spectrum, which is harder. So we go through various community-based organizations that are also sharing with us. It's a challenge to reach people. We go to schools and schools say it's a challenge to reach parents. We have also civic associations. So we have between now 40 and 45 civic associations in our district, all volunteer-based organizations where people show up usually once a month to talk about development, housing, you name it, and they're all across the city. And we started pouring more resources into them. So we have this civic empowerment series where every other month we bring these leaders together across our district, because I have Jamaica Plain and Rosendale as well. We say, one, you guys need to know each other. If you live in this part of Dorchester, great. You need to know your neighbors in Rosendale, Jamaica Plain, and Mattapan. You're all in this together. So I resource through my office space for those folks, those leaders to come together and share best practices, network, develop leadership skills, make sure the civic associations that they run are reflective of the community they serve. I'm actually hosting a summit, and we'll get you guys flyers for this summit. This summit that we're doing on November 23rd is just, it's sort of a continuation of this work where we're bringing together the civic associations from all across the city. But where we have barriers is we want more investment in this type of work. And the challenge is usually language access. How do we reach communities where English is not a first language? We only have so much capacity in our office. Organizations only have so much capacity, so we rely on them as much as we can. How do we do it in a consistent way, set up processes and practices? That's just something we're working on. It is hard. But the best thing about the summit is it's a starting place for us to just bring people together. I have a lot of funders who are funding this all-day event. It's completely free to folks in the community, and we're asking folks to let us know if they need language services to make it work. But post the summit, I'm going to circle back with a group of funders to say, how do we make this easier to do so that everyone is welcome, regardless of their language, regardless of their background, so that they can fully participate in these civic associations in their community? Because then that's where us in government have the power to really effectuate change. But it is a challenge, it is hard, but I'm intentional about making it the foundation of the work. And it's not just about people voting. I said, even if we had 5,000 people vote, but we had, say, 30,000 people that were regularly showing up to our offices to engage in the work, that to me is more powerful. Because we can get them to vote, but we want them to be at the table informing the work that we do, because we don't always get it right from in here, because we're limited in our perspective as well.